personnel.
So as you were following that plane and trying to get that plane to respond, how did that impact your ability to track Flight 93, United 93?
Well, again, this is before.
That was before?
That was before.
Okay.
That was between the second plane hitting the World Trade Center and United getting hijacked. United 93 getting hijacked.
In 93, we still was there.
Okay. And so at what point did you know that United 93 was hijacked?
Well, we heard the screaming. We heard the screaming on the frequency. One thing I might want to point out here, we didn't hear what they say we heard, because what they played for people and what they played for the families was the cockpit voice recorder, which records everything that was said in the cockpit. But when they were talking to us in the heat of the struggle, they were talking before they keyed the mic. So there's a momentary pause there anyway. So you don't hear the first part of it. So we didn't hear Mayday. We heard, just a guttural A sound. It was pretty hard to make it out the first one, because when we heard the first screaming, it actually came out in the speaker because I was on the line. I was on the landline coordinating with Indianapolis Center on an aircraft that wanted to turn around because New York started to shut off traffic. So he wanted to go back to his departure airport. He was right at the boundary, so we were on the line coordinating that. And then we heard it come out in the speaker, and I looked at my manual controller and said, "Dave, did that sound the same to you as it did to me?" And he just kind of wide-eyed and nodded his head. And then we heard another one shortly after that.
Block for an 89. Are you watching the tag 5-1 out there? I guess.
Yes, I am. I guess we did a right turn back.
They're going to right turn back. We'll have to we'll just put them in back to direct St. Louis, and they can put in whatever they want, just so we can stand them off.
Marine.
Yeah, then.
If Air Canada continues this climb, can you take them climb to 35 or 39?
Back in 1060 with him for 3 tunnel.
Doesn't look like it.
No, it doesn't look like it. Doesn't
All right,
look good.
thanks.
Somebody call Cleveland.
Roger, American 1060 with you. We're 370. We're slowing due to the delays possible. We're going eastbound.
That's American 1060.
So how long was Flight 93, United 93, in your sector? And what was your experience?
In my sector for probably 25 minutes, 30 minutes. 25 to 30 minutes.
Okay, and so in that 25 to 30 minutes, what did you experience?
Oh, you want to know when I thought it was okay. We heard the screaming. We weren't sure who it was initially. Then we saw United descended 700 feet. The mode C readout gives the altitude readout, showed that he went down 700 feet. So I'm pretty sure that's the guy. Then he came back up. It's the autopilot probably brought it back up. And then there were a couple other little fluctuations, 200 or 300 feet. It has to be 300 feet actually before it chokes out. So I started to go around calling all the other aircraft, issuing traffic, or asking them questions just to find out who was talking to me and who might have been hijacked. Because at the time, I knew about American 77. I knew that the second plane had hit the World Trade Center. They had this United, I thought, and then they called about Delta 19. They called me about Delta 1989, and somebody thought that he was hijacked because he fit the profile of the first couple aircraft out of Boston. So I said, how many are there? 5, 6, 30? Do I have to check everybody? So that's the assumption you have to go on.
Okay. So now, I understand that there was a belief that Pittsburgh Tower may have been a target.
Yes, that was my belief, and it didn't happen until. Well, let's just go back a little bit. At the time, I believe air traffic nationwide thought there were about 12 airplanes missing, and that was incorrect, of course. It was kind of the fog of wartime. People were passing back and forth stale information or incorrect information. And the Pentagon had been hit. We knew the Twin Towers were burning. And 2 minutes after the Pentagon was hit, a controller who I trained back in the 80s yelled, "Mal, I need you here." And I knew by the sound of his voice there was something very wrong. So I ran to the scope and he pointed to what's called a primary target. When an aircraft has the transponder turned on, as John was talking about, the readout on the display gives you the aircraft call sign, type aircraft, altitude, and ground speed. Well, this was a primary target, just the aircraft itself. The terrorists flying 93, as well as the other planes, turned off the transponders to try to inhibit easy tracking of the aircraft. So he pointed this primary target and said, "This airplane's been hijacked over Cleveland. They don't know where it's going. They think it has a bomb on board." Now that came from your D-man. Yeah, there generally in an en route sector, in a center, there's not just a guy sitting in scope, there's a couple of assistants. So that information had been given to him, my controller, over the intercom. And I could tell two things very quickly in 2 sweeps of the radar. The first thing was that the aircraft was going very fast, probably at or close to a speed called VNE, velocity never exceed. Every aircraft has design limitations, and you don't want to fly beyond that speed because you can damage the aircraft. But the clowns flying these planes were concerned about hitting the target and not preserving the integrity of the airframe. The other thing I could tell was that the aircraft was heading directly for the airport, which the control tower at the airport is only about 240 feet off the ground. But in terms of altitude above mean sea level, compared to buildings in downtown Pittsburgh, it's taller than most of them, because downtown Pittsburgh is 500 feet below the surface of the airport. So we knew the Pentagon was hit, just hit. We thought there may be a dozen airplanes missing. Airplanes coming for us, so what that does before downtown, I assumed that we were a target, so I evacuated the facilities.
And John, did they also evacuate Cleveland Center?
They did. It wasn't because of the bomb scare like it's been reported. It was because there was a small aircraft flying around and nobody knew who it was, and they were afraid that he was. I didn't think that, so I stayed. I stayed in, and I was in there till noon, and then they figured he's probably the last guy we should have in there. Get him out.
How involved were you with landing there?
At the oral history report, they asked me how many, and I said about 80, which was impossible. Because in 2 minutes, impossible. From the time we learned the aircraft was coming in, we had about 8 aircraft in the system. When I made the announcement to evacuate, 2 or 3 of the airplanes saw each other in the airport and followed them one in trail to the airport. A couple were giving hold instructions in the airspace, and we told them we'd be back to them in 10 or 15 minutes. If they didn't hear anything, they would return to Cleveland and get further instructions. But we didn't want to give Cleveland more problems right away. I figured we could take care of the airspace in a reasonable amount of time after the evacuation.
So what was it like for both of you, given that your entire careers were in air traffic control? What was it like not having any planes?
You mean those careers that were flashing in front of our eyes? That's about what it was like. Don't make a mistake here. This is big. That's all you can think about. Whatever you do, don't do anything wrong. No. But we weren't trained for this, obviously. They used to have a test that you made a guesstimate about how long it would take if there was a nuclear attack on getting airplanes out of your sector, but they couldn't really get them on the ground. You know, they would say after 10 minutes, they said, "Oh, well, we got everybody down in 10 minutes." No, you didn't. You got them from this sector to that sector to this sector. But, so it was pretty much winging it, you know. It was, but I worked United, with Delta 1989, who was behind the one they thought. He was 20 miles in trail. And I also worked Ashcroft's flight later. So I had a pretty full morning. We figured out a way to get the Attorney General back to Washington without me getting thrown in prison.
When I gave the order to evacuate, the aircraft was 30 miles from the airport. And we bailed out. There was a predetermined point we'd go to together and decide what to do next. As people left the facility, I went to see, we had some handicapped folks in wheelchairs that I wanted to make sure they had been cleared from the facility and they were gone. So I walked back through the radar room, and 93 was now 10 miles from the airport, still headed directly at it. And the radar recording reveals it passed over the airport. But when I got out, I think when I got out to the gathering point, the plane had already passed over top of us. We never saw it. You'd think in a sunny day like that, you'd see it blend off the skin, but it never happened. So it was not necessarily the culmination of my career, but it was something we'd never done before. John was talking about stopping or putting airplanes on the ground. The procedure was called SCATANA, Security and Control of Air Traffic and Navigational Aids. And it was a Cold War procedure designed for through the nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. Everything on the ground, everything would stay on the ground that was on the ground. Everything in the air would be landed at the closest airport. And it turns out that we followed SCATANA without realizing it by the decision to stop all departures and ground all airplanes.
So, what were your thoughts when you heard that a plane had crashed or something?
Mine initially was anger and frustration that we couldn't do more to top it. I mean, you could hope that something was going to happen. It was pretty inevitable. We heard the other ones were suicide missions. What went through my mind was they're going to crash it somewhere. We're not going to let it be landed. And I thought maybe they'd put it into Pittsburgh. I was hoping they didn't. You know, we were just trying to keep them, in the air. That's why I was trying to get him to talk to me to see what his intentions were. Because all I have is a microphone, frequency, and radar. Right? I can't turn the guy myself or land him or shoot him down or anything. So I figured I'd let the military do that. But when we found out later that the military didn't know about it, it makes what the people on that flight did even more impressive to me.
How did I feel? Bewildered, I think, is how I felt, and anger and a deep sense of mourning for what humanity was obviously getting itself into. When we were out in the parking lot, which is the assembly point, I had a cell phone with me, and we were to call a number in case we ever went out of business for weather, thunderstorms, or electrical failures, whatever. I opened my cell phone and called the number, and I couldn't get a dial tone. And the reason I couldn't get a dial tone is because all the people in the airplanes that had taxied out for departure and couldn't take off. And the several airplanes that landed, all the people on those flights were on their cell phones trying to find out what was going on. I went back into the facility by myself to see if there was still a threat to the airport. And 93 was no longer on the scope. Now, the radius of the Pittsburgh radar is 60 nautical miles or 120 nautical miles across. Shanksville, by my plot, is about 6 or 8 miles off the edge of the radar scope. So as I learned more and more what happened, I learned that crossing over the Pittsburgh airspace, the let's roll call, flight attendants filling pitchers with hot water to throw them terrorists, and people calling their families to say goodbye, all happened under the Pittsburgh radar coverage, and we couldn't do a thing for them. Somehow I feel there's a piece of me in the field out there, and I come back and
I mentioned earlier there was no training, and you said that you all went into autopilot with what to do and how to accomplish getting all this stuff up in the air. What was it like? I mean, I know for me, I lived close to the Pittsburgh airport at the time and had always had planes overhead after somewhere, and the silence was just eerie. As air traffic controller, how did you do without any planes being in the air?
I didn't really notice it until that night. I went in for, I was a 6 to 2 shift that day, and then I went in for my midnight shift, starting at 10:30. That's when I noticed it. Nobody there. But I would say nobody. We did work a couple of ambulance flights. They were still live, and there were some militaries out there. But it was strange, not seeing anything. They were wondering why I didn't take the day off, and I thought the FBI was going to talk to me, which they didn't. So I went in, and I said, "There's not going to be any traffic anyway. Why are you guys worried about me?" But,
My relief, who was a fellow I trained, came a little bit early to work, and he said, "It's time for you to go home. You've done your job." There were several other decisions that I made that I think were probably really decent ones. And I didn't want to leave the facility, but there was no reason not to go. So I thought, I'd really like to have a drink. Now, do you know what a rusty nail is? Half scotch, half cranberry, lots of ice. And I thought I'd like a rusty nail, so I went to the state store and they were all closed. I got home and I had one, which kind of slowed things down for me. Now, it's not my intent to offend anyone based on their religious beliefs, so please forgive me if I do. But I consider a rusty nail a religious drink, because if you have two, you see God, and if you have three, she talks with you. So that day was my Friday, and I had a day and a half off, and came back to work a week of midnight shifts, and there was absolutely nothing happening. And it's hard enough to stay awake at 3 o'clock in the morning talking to airplanes. To try to stay awake at 3 o'clock in the morning not doing anything but reading a book is tough. I felt a sense, again, emptiness. I visited with my mentor who had retired. He lived under the Cotta intersection, by the way. And that would be a feeder route to the Pittsburgh airport. And we sat out back on his deck and drank scotch for 4 or 5 hours and just listened to the silence. It was stunning.
John and Val, you both have had long careers in the care and safety of our nation's airways. What impact did the events of September 11th have on you?
it actually lengthened mine by about 14 months. Because I was put under subpoena for the Masauli trial. I think I was the only controller that was. So I thought, well, it would be a lot easier for me to get in to listen to tapes and read the transcripts of what happened for my testimony if I was still working. But after a year and a half or so, it was obvious this was going to drag on and drag on. I think it was 4 years before they finally caught the plea. So I decided on this one. If I have to get in, I'll go through the manipulations.
My career was at its end. I planned to retire in January of '02, but I had a sleeping room, or a bachelor pad in Pittsburgh, and my family lived in Lancaster County. We made that decision that Chris would stay where she was. Her father was not well, and our girls were close to Lancaster. So I drove back and forth on weekends. Driving a 500-mile round trip to mow the lawn is not too much fun. But I had planned to retire in January of '02. And when I was home over Labor Day weekend, I realized that Chris had her hands full with her dad and her work. And I just felt it was time for me to come home and help out. So I got back to work and talked to my boss and said, I'd just like to retire as quickly as possible. And he said, could you stay until September 30? And I said, yes. So it wasn't long after that 9/11 happened. And if I hadn't already made that decision to retire on the last day of September, I just wouldn't have gone back to work.
Now, you've been a board member of the Friends of Flight 93 and frequently do public speaking and tell the story of the 40 heroes. What has fueled that passion for you?
About 10 years ago, maybe 11, there was a fundraiser for the memorial, and I was asked to speak with a family member who was related to one of the flight attendants. And I learned that day that people listened to what I had to say. And I was a founding member of the Friends of Flight 93 and thought I could just start doing that talk to raise money for the memorial. And that has since translated into a DVD, which is available at the bookstore, by the way, called 9/11 and the Heroes of Flight 93. And it tells my story from my perspective. And I intertwine known events of the day with what happened on the airplane with my day. There's a control tower in the back and then the 40 heroes in the front. And I will give this talk anywhere you want me to. If I need to go to California, I like the flight reimbursement, and maybe an overnight stay someplace. But I'm available to make this talk. It's a passion of mine to get the word out to young people. When I speak at colleges and high schools, it's increasingly evident that today's youth do not have any connection to and very little knowledge of 9/11/01. And that's kind of evidenced by how many folks here are under the age of 21? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, I'm glad you're here. But it's evident that there should be more here. And how do we fix that? Each one of you folks has a 9/11 story. I urge you to sit down with the young people in your lives and tell them about your day, and then reach into the broader subject. If we forget this time, it's going to happen again. We cannot allow that to happen. And how can you help? Join the Friends of Flight 93. Again, talk to the young people. Bring them to the memorial. If you haven't been down to the plaza yet, you'll find that when you walk onto that sacred ground, that people immediately start to whisper in most cases. And you will feel a heaviness and a sacredness that you'd feel at the Arizona Memorial or the Vietnam Wall or the World War II Memorial. End of commercial.
Okay, we have some time now. We're going to open it up for audience questions for either Mal or John.
I have two questions. One is, did the Air Force intend to shoot 93 down if it got close to Washington?
The Air Force didn't know about it until after he crashed. You can't talk about United 93 without talking about Delta 1989 and to some extent American 11, because they were both misidentified. American 11, somebody thought that he was still flying towards Washington. So when they say they were looking for a flight coming to Washington, another flight coming to Washington, it wasn't United 93, it was American 11. They didn't know about 93 until, Meads didn't know until after he crashed. And Delta 1989 landed at Cleveland, thank God, because they were going after him, because he was misidentified and misinformation was given that he was hijacked. And I'm sitting there thinking, he's not the one, it's this one. And nobody would believe me. My supervisor kept coming around the corner. Oh, it's the Delta. I said, it's not the Delta. I said, not yet anyway. We didn't know what was going to happen eventually, but I said, it's not him. So they didn't know about United. I thought maybe when United went down in the open field, I thought maybe the military did get it, and we never saw them because they were under the radar. But it didn't happen. They didn't know about it. Unfortunately, it just didn't work. The system broke down. The bureaucracy broke down.
Yeah, the requirements to be a follower of radar and all those things they've changed the regulations or the restrictions to become one of them?
When I was hired, you had to read, write, and speak the English language and be of a good moral character. Well, they failed on that point. But I have no idea what the restrictions are now. Do you, John? There are, historically, controllers were drawn from the military. There are now a number of colleges that give associate degrees in aviation. There's a very active college at the Beaver County, Pennsylvania, Beaver County Community College, that actually runs a control tower and trains people to do the job. But as far as exact requirements, I'm sorry. There were none in our airspace that we were aware of. It's interesting. The last time I checked, there were at least 4 or 5 truther websites that contend that the reason the radar room at Pittsburgh was evacuated was so that the controllers wouldn't see the plane shot down. Well, I'll go any place and take any lie detector test to tell you that I was responsible for the evacuation because I was legitimately concerned about the people who worked for me. We did launch tankers, military refueling aircraft, KC-135s. In fact, that's one of the things that reinforced what we were doing was in line with Skatana. When we were in the parking lot and I talked to the control tower supervisor, he said, as I was leaving, I called their command post, and they said, we're going bust out. Now, bust out was designed for the nuclear exchange. And that just kind of made the day complete. It was total chaos. But they're the only airplanes that were military in our airspace.
My recollection may be a little off after all this time, but I don't know of anybody that was launched in response to United 93. Built in 1989, there was a training plant, I believe, out of Selfridge around Detroit. I don't even know if any of them were armed, but they were notified, and then I believe a few aircraft got off of Toledo late. It was after he landed at Cleveland. Delta landed at Cleveland. And by the way, that was one of the ones where one of the conspiracy theories came out because Mayor White, Mayor of Cleveland at the time, saw a microphone and jumped in front of it because he's a politician. And he said, somebody landed in Cleveland, we think it was United 93. So they just got conflated, and it was actually the Delta 1989.
John, I just want to say thank you for taking the safety of your workers in consideration. You didn't have the full picture, so thank you for doing that. But what is technically happening with the airplanes as Pittsburgh Airport is now closed? If you were in that airspace, what was the communication there?
They were issued holding instructions, and we told them we'd be back in 10 minutes. If we did not return, they were to go to Cleveland Center for further instructions.
So if you're flying in the air, you're going to be headed towards Cleveland, or could you have been headed towards Philadelphia? I guess in my mind, I'm not sure where planes are going, in that area.
Well, where they were headed was to Pittsburgh.
Okay.
So it didn't matter if they're going east or west.
So within 10 minutes they didn't hear from you, they were supposed to go towards Pittsburgh.
Right.
Gotcha. Thank you.
If I could still have the mic, you see the angels gather here, I wanted to share that with you folks. The first time I visited Shanksville was December 6th after the attacks. And the temporary memorial consisted of a cyclone fence with people who left mementos, Purple Hearts, badges from police and fire companies, handwritten notes by children. And this Angels Gather Here sign was what caught my attention and just shook me to my very soul. Because how could such a horrible thing happen without some kind of divine intervention. Angels gathered here is what the sign said on December 6, 2001. When I read those words, I was shaken to my very soul.
What have we changed to prevent this from happening, or what would we do if something similar to this was occurred?
In the past, we had no direct line from the controller to the military. They put those in right away. Now you could call right into Huntress and give them the information, because the disconnect was just so bad previously.
I live about 2 miles west of Latrobe Airport, and one of the rumors circulating at that time was that there was a general aviation plane flying, and that man was asked to tail Flight 93 because it was off the radar. They were trying to identify it, so they were asking this guy, again flying this this plane, to get a tail number or something like that. Is that true?
If you're talking about the low altitude one, I don't know if that's true or not. I heard the same thing. But I had an executive jet that saw him when he was descending out of 41,000 feet. He was 20 miles away or so. But at the time, when they said they had a bomb, one of the first things I thought about was just a couple of weeks before that, they were talking about the Russian nuclear suitcase bombs that were unaccounted for. Could they have one of these? I didn't think so. I thought since the planes were hitting buildings, that the planes were the bombs. But I couldn't take that chance. And the exec jet kind of gave me the impression that he would tail this guy, the flight. But I didn't want to put him at risk too. I mean, what if I have no idea what the shock wave is from a nuclear device, no matter how big it is, at altitude especially.
How we got the word about bombs. The hijackers flying the airplanes did not understand the comm systems, and they would press the mic and transmit their traffic thinking they were talking to people in the back of the airplane. And I believe 3 of the 4 aircraft said, "We have a bomb," and that's how we found out.
So what happened after the 10 minutes? Did y'all go back
to work?
Y'all went back in?
Yeah, that's when I returned to the facility. United was off the radar, so I called people back in, and we were back in business. But there was unfortunately not too much to talk to. I'm sorry.
Everybody else landed?
Yes, the ones who had seen the airport landed, and the other 1 or 2 we brought in via radar vectors.
Was there a general order issued for this ground stopping and diversion of flights?
It came from what was called the National Command Center, which was in Herndon, Virginia, and they're responsible for adjusting flows of traffic across the country and rerouting traffic for weather or traffic congestion or interruptions that are not expected. John can probably speak more to that, because I think the flow control would affect him more directly.
In the past, that's all we thought. The command center was basically a big flow control facility. So when they said they're telling you that this guy has to land, and the Attorney General has to land, that's where that came from. I'm thinking, some bureaucrat or the Attorney General? I put the Attorney General. The ground stop, I wish it would come right after the second plane hit the World Trade Center. In United 93, they wouldn't have taken off. Or after the second one was, I take that back, after the second one was hijacked. We hit the World Trade Center like 2 minutes after, I believe, United took off.
After Cleveland, how low did they drop? Were they detectable on your radar after they started to turn around Cleveland, or when did they drop?
They dropped. 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 They dropped
that you weren't able to detect them? When did that happen?
It started out at 35,000 feet, when they first checked on. Then he went down 700 feet. Then he went back up, which the autopilot took him up. Then when he got to Cleveland, he made a big turn. First he went a little bit to the right, then he went left, and as he turned, he climbed, and he went up to 41,000 feet. And when he got around Akron, he started a rapid descent. When he turned southeast, that's when I thought he was going to Washington. Initially, I thought he was going back to New York, because what you don't see when they show the track, the tracks are based on that they put out are based on the history that's in the computer. They have a program that corrects for minor deviations, so that controllers don't have systems errors because they got a bad head on the radar. So actually, he went a little bit to the east for a couple of miles, and I thought he was going back to New York, and then he turned southeast.
And we'll take one more question. We got somebody in the
I
back.
just have a comment. I know when my adrenaline is rushing that it's very difficult to think, and I thank you gentlemen for being as clear thinking as you were. Hindsight is wonderful, isn't it? We could all correct it, but you guys were right there, right at that time, and had to do the best thing that you could, and a lot of Americans admired you then, so thank you, sir. Gentlemen.
Thank you.
Clear thinking? Ask my wife.
Thank you everyone for coming today. We really appreciate your attendance. This is the last in our summer series of the speaker series.